Thanks so much for that very kind introduction, Audrey. Thanks, Grant, for bringing me out here. Thanks to all of you, American Library of Paris patrons and supporters, for coming out tonight. It's really wonderful to be back here. I was here last year, and things have changed a little bit in the United States in the last year. I literally got into Paris on Sunday. Monday. I left on Sunday. And I think it's fairly safe to say that it's an ambivalent time to be an American today, no matter what your political beliefs or your partisan leanings happen to be. But for me, it's always been a little bit of an ambivalent experience to be an American, because I was, or am, a refugee. And I came to the United States in 1975. And as I was growing up in the United States throughout the 1970s and 1980s, my father would always say to me, "You are 100% Vietnamese." So, in 1994, the United States reestablishes relationships with Vietnam, and my parents take the first opportunity after 19 years to go back to Vietnam to visit their country. And after the second visit, they come back to the United States, and over Thanksgiving, my father says to me, "We're Americans now." Which I think is actually a very common refugee and immigrant experience, that you change over time, even though you don't know it. And your country of origin changes over time, even though you don't know it. And it's the return to that origin that becomes kind of a shock. And that's one of the good experiences about being in Paris on July 4th, is I get to look at my other country from a distance with a little bit of shock as well, seeing what's happening out there. And one of the reasons why, obviously, the United States feels like an ambivalent place today for many of us who are immigrants or refugees is because of the political controversies around immigrants and refugees in the United States. And I started off by saying that I am a refugee. And it feels a little bit odd to say that, because clearly you are looking at one refugee who has become quite bourgeoisie. And that raises a very valid question of how long someone can claim to be a refugee, and if they ever cease being a refugee. Well, in my case, I came to the United States when I was 4 years old, and my memories begin with being a refugee. I didn't remember anything about Vietnam, and instead my memories begin in the place where we were resettled. So 130,000 Vietnamese refugees come to the United States in 1975, fleeing the end of the Vietnam War, which they obviously lost. And the United States set up 4 camps throughout the country to process these refugees. My camp turned out to be Fort Indiantown Gap in Pennsylvania. And my first memories are actually of being separated from my parents. Because in order to leave one of these refugee camps, you had to have an American sponsor willing to guarantee your fate in this society. Now, in my family's case, no one sponsor would take all of us. So one sponsor took my parents, one sponsor took my 10-year-old brother, and one sponsor took 4-year-old me. And I remember how painful that experience was, being taken away from my parents, howling and screaming and not understanding what was happening, or if I was going to be returned to them someday. And now I'm the father of a 4-year-old child, and I can see the world a little bit through his eyes, and I can see how horrifying it would be for him and for me if my son were to be taken away from me. But this is where my memories begin, with this refugee experience. And I speak of this refugee experience when in my case, that separation lasting a period of about 3 months for me, which, when you're 4 years old, seems like forever. And my brother, who was 10 years old, was actually taken away from my parents for 2 years. And that's why he says to me, "We know Mom and Dad loved you more." Because they couldn't bear to be separated from me for much longer than that. But I tell him, "Look, 10 years later, you were accepted by Harvard." And then just to rub it in, he went to Stanford as well after that. And I mention all these experiences not simply to say that being a refugee is all bad, because being a refugee has given me the requisite emotional damage necessary to become a writer. And I do my best to try to pass it on to my son. He's 4 years old. He's an American. He's middle class. And like many middle class American kids, he really loves Legos. And you can get them here in Paris too. So I remember distinctly we were here last year in Paris, and he would always beg to go to the Lego store. And he'd always beg to have more Legos. And you know you can't give kids everything they want. So I said to him, no, you can't have these Legos. And I asked him, do you know why you can't have these Legos? And he said, because you're a refugee? And I said, that's right. It's important to try to instill empathy in your children. He walked down the streets of Paris, after some of this treatment, and he would see people on the sidewalks holding signs saying that they were refugees. And he would say, are these refugees? And I said, well, at least they say they are. And I think it's important to instill that sense of empathy, because according to the United Nations, we live in a world right now which has about 66 million or so displaced people, of whom the United Nations classifies about 22 or 23 million officially as refugees. It's an interesting distinction, because I'm pretty sure many of those 66 million people or 44 million people who are classified as displaced people probably imagine themselves as being refugees. Now, that distinction between refugees and other kinds of populations is really, really crucial. Probably different here in Paris or in France than it is in the United States. But in the United States, there's a significant difference between refugees versus immigrants. In the United States, we're a country of immigrants. And even at this moment in history where there is rising xenophobic feeling against immigrants, even the people who are opposed to immigrants nevertheless believe in the idea that immigrants should want to come to the United States because we're awesome. Right? Refugees in the United States are a different matter. Refugees are unwanted where they come from, and unwanted usually where they go to. Now, in some cases, in certain countries, maybe refugees are wanted, but I think that's a matter of scale. When there are a few refugees coming to your door, maybe they're acceptable. When there are tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of refugees coming to your door, then the situation changes. And so that's one of the reasons why the United States, in addition to many other countries, is experiencing these so-called refugee problems. And for me, thinking back to that experience of what it was like to be a 4-year-old removed from my parents and taken away from them, I can't help but feel that regardless of our stances on refugees and undocumented immigrants, there are still moral and humanistic guidelines that we should believe in and that we should follow. And that's why, for me, talking about refugees today, it's very difficult not to draw the connection to other kinds of stigmatized populations who are moving across borders. And of course, we know that that has reached a reached a high moment of crisis in the last few weeks in the United States, with undocumented children being taken away from their parents. It's not clear that we've put a stop to that, but even if we have put a stop to that, we're still putting undocumented families in detention camps. And most recently, the United States government has asked the United States military to prepare certain kinds of military installations to house undocumented families, including Camp Pendleton. Camp Pendleton was one of the 4 camps used in 1975 to house Vietnamese refugees, and now it's being asked to house undocumented families as they're prepared to be deported. I've gone around the United States talking about these kinds of issues in different kinds of populations, including populations of refugees. And what's interesting for me to see is that even for those people who are officially classified as refugees, there's often a huge incentive not to call themselves refugees. I went and visited one high school in Idaho to talk to students, and I was told many of these students are refugees. I thought, great. I opened my talk by asking them, how many of you are refugees? Nobody raised their hands. I asked, how many of you are immigrants. And then they started to raise their hands. So the country is already sending a message out to these young people who are officially classified as refugees that there is something wrong with being classified as a refugee. I think it's because refugees bring with them this idea of contamination. Not just the idea of hygienic contamination or other kinds of contamination, but the contamination of being a refugee. The fear that what these refugees bring with them is the possibility that we might one day be refugees ourselves. Or they bring with them the uncomfortable reminder that perhaps these refugees are here because we might have been involved with their country at some point in the past that we would prefer to forget. In the case of the United States, I think we have a particular allergy to refugees because of our history of the American dream. Now, some of these Vietnamese refugees, for example, who came to the United States in 1975, ended up being resettled in Louisiana. And 30 years later, something called Hurricane Katrina happened. Tens of thousands of people were displaced by Hurricane Katrina. And some of the American media called these people refugees. President George Bush at the time said, it's un-American to call these people refugees. And for perhaps the only time in history, Jesse Jackson agreed with him. A lot of these people were African Americans, and Jesse Jackson said, it's racist to call African Americans refugees. I thought, that's great. We refugees have succeeded in bringing together America in hating us. One of the ironies of all of this is, as I mentioned earlier, that many refugees are encouraged not to call themselves refugees, and even worse, are encouraged to take a stance against new refugees. So for me, as someone who's Vietnamese and as someone who was a Vietnamese refugee who benefited from being taken into this country, along with 130,000 others of my countrymen and countrywomen, it's particularly saddening and shocking for me to hear that there are former Vietnamese refugees in the United States who say, we should not accept any more refugees, any more of these new refugees from places like Syria or people who are Muslim, for example, because we were the good refugees. These people are bad refugees. Well, I grew up in San Jose, California of the 1970s and 1980s in a very large Vietnamese refugee community. And let me assure you, there were a lot of bad Vietnamese refugees. But they've forgotten about that history. Just as many Vietnamese refugees, former Vietnamese refugees, have forgotten that in 1975, the majority of Americans did not want to accept Vietnamese refugees. But these former Vietnamese refugees who oppose new refugees are continuing in a rather classically American fashion by forgetting the past. Americans, for the most part, are descended from refugees and immigrants. But even a separation by a generation or two or three, as in the case of White House Chief of Staff John Kelly, allows people to forget their origins. John Kelly has been vocal in supporting White House administration policy on denying entry to those people that he considers to be uneducated immigrants, forgetting the fact that his own great-grandparents were uneducated immigrants from Italy and Ireland. And in the case of Vietnamese refugees today, they're doing exactly that same all-American pattern of forgetting their own history in order to deny entry to new refugees and to new immigrants. But even raising that idea of good refugees and bad refugees is kind of problematic, because it begs the question, who is a good refugee and who is a bad refugee? I look back on the community of the 1970s and 1980s in San Jose, California, and I see that people were doing things like cheating welfare, engaging in insurance scams, doing cash under the table economies. We invented the home invasion in San Jose, California. There were a lot of bad refugees. But why did they do those things that they did? Perhaps they learned how to cheat the economy, how to be corrupt, from having been colonized for a century by the French and having been occupied by the Americans for a few years. And both of those occupations by the French and the Americans bred corruption among the French and the Americans, but also among the Vietnamese as well. And those young men who were engaging in these home invasions of other Vietnamese people's homes, including my home, perhaps they learned those things from the violence that they saw, or the violence that their own fathers and uncles and brothers underwent as well. And when we talk about good refugees, like the doctors and the lawyers and the engineers and the pharmacists and the insurance salesmen that Asian and Vietnamese immigrant and refugee parents want their children to be, it's all great for them that they do those kinds of things. But how good are they? Do they do anything for anybody besides themselves? So I want to raise that question of good and bad refugees because right now it seems as if the only acceptable refugee or immigrant in France and the United States are those people who are exceptional. Those people who went to Harvard, like my brother. Those people like me who won the Pulitzer Prize. But if we only accepted people who could go to Harvard or win the Pulitzer Prize, we wouldn't have very many refugees and immigrants coming into our countries, which is probably the point. But on this day, July 4th, American independence, I want to affirm that I believe in the American ideal of equality. Equality for all. Equality for refugees and immigrants to come to the United States and be mediocre, just like all other Americans. Even if we reject that idea of mediocrity, and we affirm only the ideal of superiority, which is currently where American immigration policy is headed, we have to acknowledge that there are problems with superiority as well. And that superiority is really only a trick. We're going to let these people in only if they're superior, only if they're exceptionally well qualified. We say this today in order to deny entry to people who we perceive to be unqualified in whatever circumstance. But I will guarantee you, once we have denied entry to people who are supposedly unqualified or undesirable, we're going to turn our attention to those people who we said were superior and desirable in the first place. I'll give you an example. In 1978, my family decided to move from from Harrisburg, Pennsylvania to San Jose, California, and they opened perhaps the second Vietnamese grocery store in San Jose. They did what they were supposed to do as refugees to the United States. They came and they opened a business. And I remember when I was about 10 or 11 years old in the early 1980s, walking down the street from my parents' store and seeing a sign in another window that said, "Another American driven out of business by the Vietnamese." And I thought, I was 10 or 11 years old, I don't think I fully comprehended what that sign meant. But I thought, does that person who put up that sign in that window know that my parents work 12 to 14-hour days in this grocery store every day of the year, except Christmas, Easter, and New Year's? Does this person know that my parents were shot in this store on Christmas Eve? Does this person know everything my parents had to go through in order to become the people that they are and to survive being refugees twice? Once in their own country in 1954 and once again in the United States, to the United States. And of course, that person didn't know that, didn't want to know that. And I didn't really know how to say that at the time. Only a few years later, I would go on to attend this very elite high school in San Jose, mostly a white high school, except for a handful of us who were of Asian descent. And we knew we were different. We just didn't know how to say it. So every day at lunch, we would gather in a corner of the campus, and we would call ourselves the Asian Invasion. Funny thing is, I visited my campus again last year, 30 years after I graduated, and we really have taken over. But that's a whole other story. Looking back, I realized we didn't have the language to describe ourselves and our situation. I would have to wait until a few years later when I would get to college, to Berkeley, to become immediately radicalized the moment I stepped foot on campus, to find that language, to talk about what it meant to be a refugee, an immigrant, a minority, a person of color, an Asian American in American society. What I needed at that time, in the 1980s, growing up, was to hear more voices from people like me. And that's how we get to something like The Displaced, Refugee Writers on Refugee Lives. The origins of this book are not with me. They're actually with the editor of the press, Abrams Press, Jameson Stoltz. And he emailed me one day and he said, there's a Muslim ban that's happening in this country. And he said, I just realized that my wife is a refugee from the Soviet Union. It just never came up in the course of their conversations, even though they were married. But then it became an issue, because the Muslim ban was also obviously going to be a refugee ban as well. So he said, let's do something about this. Let's create an anthology of refugee writers. And so he came up with about half the writers, I came up with about half the writers, 17 writers altogether from countries as varied as Afghanistan, the former Soviet Union, Pakistan, Vietnam, Chile, Hungary, Mexico, Bosnia, Iran, Ethiopia, Zimbabwe, Laos, and Thailand. Two of the writers were born in refugee camps. And I just want to talk about a few of these essays to give you a sense of how vastly different their experiences are and what they're talking about. One essay is by Reina Grande. And Reina Grande crossed the border of the United States from Mexico as an undocumented migrant. Not technically a refugee. But I wanted to have her in the book precisely so we could bring up this issue of the distinction, or lack of distinction, between undocumented migrants and refugees. What makes someone an undocumented migrant versus being a refugee? Why does the United Nations classify some people in one way and some people in another way? And a lot of it is due to political necessity. When we came as refugees in 1975, Congress in the United States passed a special act to accept, outside of the law, outside of immigration quotas, these 130,000 refugees from Vietnam and tens of thousands more from Laos and Cambodia. Why? Well, because the United States felt like it owed something to these countries, having fought a war in these countries, and because it was good politics to accept refugees fleeing from newly communist countries. At the same time, in 1975, the United States was not, or no, soon after 1975, the United States would take further refugees from Cuba, a communist country, but would not take people from Haiti. Nowadays, when we look at people who are crossing from south of the border into the United States, why are these people undocumented migrants instead of refugees? When many of them are fleeing from circumstances in Honduras, Guatemala, El Salvador, that are the direct consequence of American actions in these countries in the 1970s and the 1980s, fomenting dictatorships, fomenting anti-guerrilla wars that led to huge casualties, huge deprivations among the civilian population. Our drug policies, our anti-drug wars in the United States are completely tied to what's happening in Latin America. There is good reason to call many of these people coming to the United States as refugees. And some of them are indeed coming to the United States officially as asylum seekers. The United Nations classifies 4 million or so of these 66 million displaced people as asylum seekers. But the United States is actively not interested in hearing any appeals for asylum from people south of the border. Instead, classifying them, including people like Reina Grande, as undocumented migrants, puts them in the category of people who are coming out of economic necessity, coming to drain the United States of its economic and its social resources. That's why I wanted to have Reina Grande's essay in this collection. Cao Clea Yang, memoirist, was born in a Thai refugee camp, but her parents were Hmong who fled from Thailand, or Laos, because they had supported the U.S. war effort during the Vietnam War. And after the end of the Vietnam War, they were actively persecuted by the victorious communists in Laos. Her essay, Cao Clia Yang's essay, is about the children born in that Thai refugee camp. That's all that they knew at the time. And she depicts a world in which these young children knew that they had to grow up much faster. They did not have the benefit, like my son, of having Legos. The story she tells is not of children going to a department store trying to find Legos. It's children trying to find food to feed their families. Because life in a refugee camp is actually not luxurious. Refugee camps are related to detention camps, concentration camps, and eventually their most extreme manifestation in death camps, in the sense that refugees are kept barely alive in refugee camps. You read accounts of people in refugee camps, they are not talking about luxury accommodations. In Cao Clia Yang's much longer memoir, The Late Homecomer, she talks about how these refugee camps are built on toilets, on former sewage sites. This is what life is like. They're barely fed enough to be kept alive. And that's why the children in her story are so concerned with breaking the law, breaking the regulations of these refugee camps in order to try to find food for their families. And I wanted to include that. In retrospect, I'm glad that I included this essay in this book, because now, as we think about what's happening in detention camps in the United States, we see that there are children as young as 3 months old being separated from their parents. They don't have to go out and find food to feed themselves, but that experience of separation from their parents and being forced to fend for themselves is emotionally devastating. I was barely separated from my parents, and it totally screwed me up. It took me decades to try to figure out what was wrong with me, my fear of separation, my anxieties, my incapacity to feel affection and emotion for people, because I was scared. But I was lucky. Many of these children won't be so lucky. So that's why I think there's a moral and a humanistic line that we have to draw, regardless of our fears about borders and national identities and national cultures. There's this greater fear of not simply losing our national identity, but losing our human identity as well in the way that we treat undocumented migrants, refugees, and children. Alexander Hamon, celebrated writer, is one of the few writers in the book to interview someone else instead of write about his personal experience. And he was a refugee from Bosnia. Actually, he was turned into a refugee because he was a student in the United States when the Bosnian War happened, and became a refugee that way. So he's doing a collection of interviews with Bosnian refugees, and the one that we got from him is about a man whose life story is much too complicated for me to tell right now. But I'll just say, for those of you who've read Candide, it's a lot like Candide. Right? That was a philosophical story that happens in real life to actual people. The degree of suffering, the degree of absurdity in the life of this refugee that Hamon documents is mind-boggling. It's not that unusual. And I wanted to include this story because it shows not just the humanity of refugees, but actually what it is that refugees have to undergo. When we see refugees being depicted in the media or in political discourse, we see them usually objectified, rendered into objects of pity, objects of spectacle, and many people think, wow, how terrible their lives must be, how pitiful these people must be. And when you read something like this interview or any of the stories in this book, I think hopefully what you come away with is that they're not pitiful. They're actually heroic for what they've had to endure and what they've had to undergo. Vietnamese refugees, for example, the ones who fled after 1975 as the so-called boat people, which is a term that I hate. I prefer to think of them as oceanic refugees. About half of those people, by UN estimates, did not survive the crossing. And many of them took to the waves in horrible, rickety boats, knowing that their odds were bad. Those odds are worse than the odds faced by astronauts. We call astronauts heroes. We call refugees pitiful. I don't think so. Not when we know what they've been through, not when we know what they've seen. But people who are invested in anti-immigrant and anti-refugee feeling are not interested in hearing about the heroic qualities of refugees and immigrants and what they've had to go through. They're focused on what it is that refugees and immigrants take away from the countries that they come to. Another essay by Dina Nayeri, originally from Iran, takes up this issue of what happens when people in host countries think about refugees. And she says that the burden placed upon refugees is the burden of gratitude, that refugees are expected to be grateful for what's being done for them. And she finds that to be a hard burden to bear. I do too. Because of course we should be grateful for being taken in by host countries. I'm grateful that my family was rescued. I'm grateful for the people who took me in as a 4-year-old out of the goodness of their hearts. But the part of me that wrote The Sympathizer, the part of me that's the novelist, the part of me that's recalcitrant, thinks, well, perhaps we wouldn't need to be grateful if you hadn't come to our country and bombed us in the first place. That's the dynamic that Dina Nayeri is talking about, that the burden of gratitude placed upon refugees is put on them so that they will also forget the historical circumstances which brought them to this country. Oftentimes circumstances brought about by the countries that they come to, whether it's because these countries bombed another country, meddled in the other country's politics, or because now we're all complicit in the climate catastrophe that's producing hundreds of thousands of refugees and will produce many, many more. Last essay I want to talk about is Maren Hidero's essay. Maren Hidero came from Ethiopia. But first she went to Germany, like me, around 3 or 4 years old. And her essay is about going to Germany and tracing the footsteps of her parents. And she says throughout that essay, I don't remember. I don't remember that this happened to my parents or that happened to my parents. But even as she's saying that, obviously she's telling us that she does remember. And as I was reading that essay, I thought, oh my God, did I plagiarize her essay? Because my essay says exactly the same thing. And Jameson Stoltz reassures me, no, she gave us that essay after you wrote the introduction. But in the introduction, I say the same thing. I don't remember. And that's a universal experience, I think, among those of us who came as children, as refugees, or as immigrants. We don't remember, and yet we do remember, because we grow up with the stories that our parents tell us. And I grew up in a Vietnamese refugee community where I was always being told the stories of melancholy, loss, pain, bitterness, anger, rage, despair that these refugees had gone through. But I was also aware of all the things that might not be said, that there were all these silences as well. And all of these things helped to shape me into the person and the writer that I became. So I just want to share with you the first couple of pages from the introduction, where I talk about this experience. I was once a refugee, although no one would mistake me for being a refugee now. Because of this, I insist on being called a refugee, since the temptation to pretend that I'm not a refugee is strong. It would be so much easier to call myself an immigrant, to pass myself off as belonging to a category of migratory humanity that is less controversial, less demanding, and less threatening than the refugee. I was born a citizen and a human being. At 4 years of age, I became something less than human, at least in the eyes of those who do not think of refugees as being human. The month was March, the year 1975, when the Northern Communist Army captured my hometown of Ban Ma Thuot in its final invasion of the Republic of Vietnam, a country that no longer exists except in the imagination of its global refugee diaspora of several million people, a country that most of the world remembers as South Vietnam. Looking back, I remember nothing of the experience that turned me into a refugee. It begins with my mother making a life and death decision on her own. My father was in Saigon, and the lines of communication were cut. I do not remember my mother fleeing our hometown with my 10-year-old brother and me, leaving behind our 16-year-old adopted sister to guard the family property. I do not remember my sister, who my parents would not see again for nearly 20 years, who I would not see again for nearly 30 years. My brother remembers dead paratroopers hanging from the trees on our route, although I do not. I also do not remember whether I walked the entire 184 kilometers to Nha Trang, or whether my mother carried me, or whether we might have managed to get a ride on the cars, trucks, carts, motorbikes, and bicycles crowding the road. Perhaps she does remember, but I never asked about the exodus, or about the tens of thousands of civilian refugees and fleeing soldiers, or the desperate scramble to get on board a boat in Nha Trang, or some of the soldiers shooting some of the civilians to clear their way to boats, as I would read later in accounts of the time. I do not remember finding my father in Saigon, or how we waited for another month until the Communist Army came to the city's borders, or how we tried to get into the airport and then into the American embassy, and then finally, somehow, fought our way through the crowds at the docks to reach a boat, or how my father became separated from us but decided to get on a boat by himself anyway, and how my mother decided the same thing, or how we eventually were reunited on a larger ship. I do remember that we were incredibly fortunate finding our way out of the country, as so many millions did not, and not losing anyone, as so many thousands did. No one except my sister. So I grew up knowing that I had this adopted sister, but knowing nothing about her except her name, Viet, and her face from one picture that my father managed to carry with him. Wallet-sized photograph. And I knew that there was an absent presence in our life, even though I knew nothing about her. And I realized, even so, that we were lucky, because I would visit homes of Vietnamese refugees. Every single home would have these black and white photographs in them. And for many of those people, those black and white photographs were photographs of the dead. That happened to my parents too. That they didn't have the luxury of being present when their own parents died. That we received news of my grandparents passing through the photographs that arrived in the mail. And I'm stunned even now as I tell you these stories because the emotions are still there. So, this is how I became a storyteller. Knowing that there were absent presences in my life and in the lives of all of these refugees, and knowing that our stories were not being told in the United States and in many of the other countries that we ended up in as refugees. And knowing that if we didn't tell our own stories, no one else would tell our stories. Or if they did, they would tell their stories in their own way to dehumanize us. So I look back on that sign in that window, another American driven out of business by the Vietnamese. 9 words, but a story, an entire story. And I realized eventually that it's an old story that had been told before us and would be told after us. And that story was another American driven out of business by throwing the blank. And if we're just talking about Asian immigrants and Asian refugees to the United States, we're talking about the Chinese who came first, and then after the Chinese there was the Japanese, and after the Japanese it was the Filipinos, and after the Filipinos it was us, and after us it was the Japanese again, and now it's the Chinese again, and now it's the North Koreans. It's the same story, told over and over and over again. And so it's up to us, who know that this story is being told, who object to this story, to change that story, to change our countries. For me as an American, that means that I believe in an America that is building bridges instead of walls. I believe in an America that is opening hearts instead of closing minds. And I believe that we who are Americans and we who believe in that country must tell that story every day to ourselves and to others. And I tell everyone I meet that you are all storytellers. We are all telling these stories every day to the people that we encounter, to our families, to our children. So it's important to keep telling the stories that we believe in, to keep affirming the America that we believe in as well. Thank you very much. Thank you. So I believe we have time for some questions. I'll try not to cry this time. By having historical memory, I hope. I think when these things started happening, we who believe in refugees, who believe in immigrants, who believe in a more welcoming and hospitable America, were shocked, right? We're taken aback because we've been living in a time period since 1965 where American immigration policy, regardless of Democrats or Republicans in charge, had been relatively liberal, and we took it for granted, right? So in 1965, a new Immigration Act is passed to make sure that every nation in the world has equal access to the United States, and we instill family reunification policies as well, which has led to obviously huge amounts of what the Trump administration is calling chain migration, I guess, right? Which would bring even more relatives of people into this country. All right. So it's shocking that it's shocking to see this coming to an end, or that the administration is trying to make this come to an end, and it's very clearly that this is the agenda, right? So when the ban on Muslims was first proposed, and when the rhetoric against refugees started to heat up, I knew immediately that the effort to ban people from coming into the United States would not stop with Muslims and with refugees. It never does, right? The call to target certain kinds of populations from coming into the country almost always is followed by calls to further limit even other groups to come into this country, which is why now we're heightening the rhetoric against heightening the rhetoric and the practice against undocumented migrants. And of course, we're about to do that now against legal immigration as well, right? The next item on the Trump administration agenda regarding immigration is to eliminate family reunification for the most part. So historically, the reason why I think it's important to have historical framework on this is that we've been in worse situations before. And throughout much of American history, preceding 1965, for 80 years or so, American immigration policy was increasingly restrictive until a point in 1924 when it was completely restricted, when America pretty much became a closed country to immigration. So I think when people are saying "Make America Great Again," maybe people initially thought maybe that slogan means the 1950s, but increasingly I think it means clearly the early 20th century, or even further back, as far back as the clock can be pushed. But the bright side out of all this is that if you're a student of history and you're a believer in the power of social struggles and political struggles, then you can see that we actually have changed, or the United States has actually changed as a country due to the political struggles of many generations throughout history. And things were overturned, things were changed. And if you go back and you read the newspapers of the 19th century and you see the kinds of cartoons that were being done of the Chinese and then the Irish, for example, they were pretty horrific. And that was the Twitter of the day that was getting people mobilized, right? And the people who were supporting immigration didn't have access to those kinds of platforms. So in response to your question, I would say yes, we're up against some great odds, but we have to believe that we can overcome those odds just as we have in the past. And how do we do it? We do it by voting, we do it by organizing, we do it by PR, as you're saying, by writing things. We do it by also trying to change conversations, change people's minds, I don't know if you can change the minds of someone who's a lot older, who's already got these beliefs entrenched in them, but the younger generation can change. I mean, we've witnessed a great degree of change in the United States around attitudes, around gay rights, for example, that would have been inconceivable 50 or 60 years ago. So we have to keep the faith that we can make these changes happen and that we can resist the kinds of retrograde policies that are being proposed now. So let me be honest, okay? Some of the people who are saying, if we accept, some of the supporters of current administration policies on refugees and immigrants are saying, those people who want to let refugees and immigrants in just believe in open borders. I do believe in open borders. I do. You know, I believe... and I'll address where we draw the line in just a moment, but I do believe in open borders, right? I do believe in open borders. Because I look back on human history, you know, and the question of drawing the line. Where do you draw the line? Where do you draw the line? And if we look back, we always drew the line. There was always a point where we would draw the line. And we would always feel, well, beyond that line, those people, those other people are unacceptable. Those other people are dangerous. We can't let them in. We have to fight wars with them and so on. Well, thousands of years ago, that line was around the village. Anybody around the village, we'd kill them. And then it was around the city. Anybody outside of the city, we'd kill them too. And then it became now the nation. So now it's completely normal to think that we identify with people in our nation, most of whom we will never ever see. 99.999% of Americans or French people we will never see. But we think of them as being as our countrymen and our kinsfolk. That means that we have to have the hope that in thousands of years, or maybe just hundreds of years, the national borders that we think to be so important now, the line that we want to draw, will be irrelevant. And that people will look back upon this time period and think, these people are brutal. You know, these people were killing each other over a national identity that really didn't mean that much to begin with. But they weren't killing each other over free trade policies that didn't draw lines anywhere. Right? That might seem more inhumane to the future than today. Now that being said, that's my utopian dream, that we have no borders, we have no lines. But where do we draw the line today? Well, there's a vast difference between saying we're not going to let anybody into the country and saying we're going to let in 90,000 people into the country. So the Obama administration policy just a few years ago was 90,000 refugees per year into the United States. Now under the Trump administration, it's 45,000 refugees per year. And the last I heard, they'd only admitted 10,000 refugees into the country. So there's a huge difference, right? And I think that's where the struggle is right now. Where do we draw the line? Well, we draw the line on a humane immigration and refugee policy. But if you're saying the line is 0, or the line is 10,000, or the line is only people who are millionaires, that's not the line, right? That's not the line. I mean, going back to the question of drawing the line, like when you were mentioning that immigrants are a positive boon to the economy of Canada and the United States, and as far as I can tell, academic studies affirm that. That immigrants are a net boon to the United States. They bring more. They pay more taxes and they reap in benefits. You give them a generation or two, they produce people who become John Kelly. Immigrants are actually less prone to crime than your average American citizen. And that's, one of the primary tools used to stoke up fear against immigrants today is that they're bringing crime to the country, for example. Well, I think that the reason why the United States is prone to this kind of phobia is because that phobia is integral to the American culture and the American character. I talked at the end of my comments. I talked about affirming the America of possibility, and I believe in that. I think that's our only hope, actually, that we have to believe in the America of possibility, the America of idealism, if we want to change things within the country. But if we're realistic about it, we also have to recognize that that America of idealism and America of possibility was always entwined with the America of genocide and racism and slavery as well, the America of colonization. And those evils in the American past are completely embedded in the American present, in material ways, in the ways that people reap the benefits of being white in the United States over generations. Psychologically, in terms of how deeply embedded racist ideas and attitudes might be, it's really hard to get rid of these things, especially when they are completely saturating your everyday life, right? And that's why I wasn't completely shocked when Donald Trump won the election, because having President Obama and President Trump back to back in American history testifies completely to the fact that the United States is a contradictory country from its very moment of origin, which probably makes the United States not that different from other places as well. This fear against immigrants and refugees is a particularly American one, stemming from our origins. I think partly implied in that is, why did I do all these things? And I think the answer is because I'm a refugee, and I just work hard. My parents worked 12 to 14-hour days in a grocery store. I would never want to do that. They would never want me to do that. But I just absorbed that attitude, like if I'm not working, something's wrong. So I just got to constantly keep working. But the other part of your question was the different kinds of choices made in fiction and nonfiction. And for example, I also write, for New York Times and other newspapers and magazines. And they fiction and nonfiction and longer and short form just accomplish different kinds of things. So for example, I find it very painful to write 1,000-word op-eds for the New York Times. They're like, how am I going to fit 2,000 words into 1,000 words? But it's like writing in a different form, like writing haikus. It's learning how to compress and realizing that I can reach different audiences with different forms. That's why I do these different things. You can only get one point across in a 1,000-word op-ed for the New York Times, but you're going to reach a huge audience, right? I've written different things because I need to reach different audiences. I need to be able to say things in certain forms that aren't sayable in others. Okay, so with the short story collection, The Refugees, these are realistic short stories. They're designed to elicit empathy and feeling and compassion and identification, all the good things that literature is supposed to do, right? But in order to do that in that more conventional way, I can't come out and say, I believe in open borders. I think The Refugees as a collection possibly affirms that idea, but I don't say it. So I have to use nonfiction to be able to say things that are much more explicit. So even The Sympathizer, which I think is a pretty politically explicit novel, is deliberately written as such, apparently still fools people. Because there are people who will write to me and say, I just read some of your nonfiction work, and I'm completely shocked that somebody who wrote The Sympathizer could write what you just wrote in that op-ed or in your nonfiction book. Which is a good thing, right? Because it means that I'm using these forms in different ways. And that even something as politically explicit as A Sympathizer is still not able to say things as directly as I could say in an op-ed or a work of nonfiction scholarship like Nothing Ever Dies. I realized that in writing The Sympathizer, and that's why I wrote Nothing Ever Dies. The two books are meant to be complementary. They're meant to say things that the other book can't say. So Nothing Ever Dies, is very explicit in talking about how I think about ethics and war and memory and my judgments upon the United States and on South Vietnam, on North Vietnam, on communism, on capitalism, very explicit about those kinds of things. But, I can't say, it's not a novel. It doesn't have characters. It doesn't allow me to exploit the same kinds of emotions that a novel does. So I just need to use all these different forms because I have so many different things I want to say to the audience. I think Macron is an apprentice of Obama more than anything else, which is to say that as critical as I am of President Trump, during the Obama administration, I was pretty critical of Obama too. Like I support President Obama in a lot of things, including his love for books. But he was engaging in certain kinds of policies that are a part of the spectrum of American politics, of which Donald Trump is taking things to an extreme. But under the Obama administration, there was family detention of undocumented migrants in camps. There was the use of drone strikes against people who had, with no legal justification, and so on. And Macron certainly seems to fit into that spectrum of power, of good-looking young men in nicely tailored suits, who you wouldn't mind having dinner with, and who can have a nice conversation about culture, who are nevertheless about state power, right, and advancing the interests of their countries. Okay. Now, outside of that, around the specific examples that you bring, I think there's interesting similarities and differences between France and the United States. But I think as I've tried to think through what those are, and as I've tried to think through which might be better systems, the American system or the French system, the American system of multicultural democracy versus the French system of sort of a universalist republicanism, which system is better for addressing equality and inequality and for promoting citizenship and access and all that other kind of stuff. And I think they're both equally good and equally flawed. I'd use another obscenity in my fiction, okay? But neither system, despite its ideals, whether it's American multiculturalism or French universalism, neither system is going to solve the problems in their respective countries. You know why? It's because the United States had genocide and slavery and racism, and the French, as far as I understand French history, have had colonization and conquest. And just as in the case of the United States, the legacies of slavery and genocide are permanently embedded in the American psyche and in American property, American patterns of segregation and living and all these kinds of things. As far as I can tell, looking at France from the outside, what France did in its colonies, which is completely contradictory to French ideals, just as what America did is completely contradictory to American ideals, those injustices are completely embedded in contemporary France. Right? So until you actually address the fact that these histories are permanently embedded, you can't solve the problem. You cannot solve the problem by giving somebody citizenship because he rescued a child from a skyscraper. You can't. You can only address the problem if you actually completely confront how it is that your contemporary society is built upon the evils of the past. And both France and the United States are not really willing to do that. Right? That doesn't mean they can't, but it's going to take a long time. And I think it's actually beneficial to look at how different societies fail to understand how our own societies fail, how different societies offer different possibilities to see what our own possibilities could be. So that's why I like to spend the summers in France, to see both what can be possible, but also to see what it is that France and the United States share in their histories of colonization and conquest and how we might go around trying to change that. Thank you so much.